Okay, we have like 1 minute until it's 8:10. A couple seconds. We'll start then. Yeah, there's a lot of white noise. I don't know how to get it out. Yeah, everyone's just gonna have to deal with the static in the background. I have no idea how to get rid of it. Oh, it's currently 8:10, so hello everyone. Welcome to the January topic analysis. I'll try to keep this not too lengthy. Feel free to ask questions as I talk throughout this thing. Okie dokie. So I'm sure everyone knows by now the topic for January is resolved the U.S. federal government should prioritize reducing the federal debt over promoting economic growth. So to start off, let's start breaking down the resolution because this is what we're debating in the first place. So the first part of the resolution, basically, the U.S. federal government is quite simple. There's not much explaining or debate that will happen there. It's just the federal government, meaning like Congress, that type of thing. So not a lot of explanation is needed for that part. The next part of the resolution is should prioritize. Now this is pretty interesting. There's a lot of debate over should, but that's actually not the most important word in this two-word phrase. What's probably the most critical is prioritize. And so what does prioritize mean? Well, over here I found two definitions for prioritize. First, prioritize means designate or treat something as more important than other things, or determine the order of dealing with something. Like if you prioritize something, you'll do it first. So these are two definitions. There's like another definition where prioritize means you put more into, like or concentrate. So basically, if you prioritize program A, you would put more resources towards program A, and essentially that's another definition. Prioritize that is probably very interesting. So since the resolution includes the word prioritize, you can be sure that's pretty important for the debate as a whole, because essentially what you're debating isn't whether or not we should only reduce debt or only promote the economy. You're debating whether or not we should prioritize reducing debt over increasing the economy. This could mean that we should prioritize debt, meaning that we should prioritize debt reduction first. Like, let's just say there's two bills that could be passed. One about cutting federal spending to reduce the debt, and one about like tax cuts to promote the economy. So if you're the pro team, you would say, well, we prioritize um, reducing the debt. So that means um, the bill about reducing federal spending gets passed first. So this interpretation of prioritize just means that you do debt reduction things first, and then you focus on like economic benefits. Now, another way you can actually frame this is prioritize as in devoting more resources. When you're talking about voting more resources, there could be political capital arguments being worked into here. Political capital just means that like bipartisanship in like Congress is very hard, and like there's only certain amounts of chances of bipartisanship to happen, and that's why um, it could be like because of the limited amount of bipartisanship and like cooperation, we need to prioritize X policy to take advantage of that political capital and concentrate all of the political capital on passing this resolution, which could be like reducing the debt through decreasing like federal spending again. So that's just two ways of defining prioritize. One could be more resources. Yeah. Number one, more resources. And number two could be order. Like you'll first reduce debt and then you'll focus on the economy. So we've more or less defined what prioritize means. I'll wait a bit for questions. Does anyone have questions? If you have questions, just put it in the chat and I'll answer. I'll wait for like a minute. Okay, no questions, I guess. Alright, let's continue. So now that we've actually defined what prioritize means, let's look towards the next part of the resolution. Basically, reducing the federal debt over promoting economic growth. I mean, I'm sure everyone knows what the federal debt is, right? Like, how much government revenue versus the spending, the difference between those two values. And we all know that the United States is in, like, a lot of debt. And that's pretty problematic, or at least that's what you're supposed to be arguing if you're the pro. And promoting economic growth is so general, so broad, because there's so many different ways you can actually promote economic growth. Most recently, there was a Tax Cuts Act passed by President Trump, and he passed this to stimulate economic growth. Typically, the most common method of stimulating economic growth is just like tax cuts, because people believe if you tax companies less, they'll grow more, and that benefits the economy. So yeah, we basically have a general understanding of the resolution. So with that said, let's move on to some more specifics. So we have the federal debt, right? We've talked about the federal debt, and I generally defined it because I assumed everyone has a rough idea of what the federal debt is. However, there is a semantic issue here, because a lot of the research published and a lot of the reports published, like on the news today, are not necessarily about debt, but about deficit. Yeah. So the difference between deficit and debt is, deficit is like the debt you accumulate in a year. It's the amount of revenue the government makes in a fiscal year versus the amount of money it spent in that fiscal year. For instance, people can say that by 2019, and from 2019 onwards, each year the United States will add at least $1 trillion in deficit. And this just means that, like, deficit is yearly. It's not the total debt as a whole. I mean, deficit is linked to debt because if you have a lot of deficits, this definitely adds to the debt. Because that means each year you're just becoming like $1 trillion more in debt. So that's just the delineation between deficit and debt. When you're articulating arguments, you want to make that clear, and you want to make sure that you're not misconstruing the two or conflating the two, because that's, well, that's poor ethics, and might not actually be advantageous to your argumentation. So now that we've actually talked about debt and deficit and the semantical issues, let's talk about something called inherency. So essentially, inherency is the probability of a policy to happen. Inherency is very important in debates like this where a policy is being debated. The policy being debated is whether or not we should prioritize reducing federal debt over promoting economic growth. So where inherency comes in is that when you're talking about ways to reduce federal debt and ways to promote economic growth. Like, the pro cannot just argue any type of like federal debt reduction method and say this is like the uh, silver bullet to solving all the issues in like the government. Yeah, so it's kind of like the price controls argument because a lot of teams argue like value-based pricing, Medicaid negotiation, and that type of thing. But whenever you're arguing a specific policy, you have to have the probability to back it up, and that's inherency. Inherency essentially is the proof that this policy is very probable. Like if I'm talking about some type of way to reduce federal spending, well, to reduce the federal debt, I wouldn't say that the United States federal government will increase taxes because the inherency of that happening under the current administration is almost next to zero, as in one of like Trump's biggest policies was the Tax Cuts Act that like reduced taxes drastically. So that's an example of inherency. And if you choose to debate policy-wise in your case, you want to have inherency there. Because, like, if your arguments aren't inherently going to happen, then they're really weak. Like, it's really easy to defeat an argument by saying, look, this argument sounds good, but the probability of it happening is absolutely zero because the current administration will never increase taxes to reduce federal debt. Instead, they'll probably like decrease discretionary spending on like social programs because that's what they've stated they wanted to do. Like the most probable argument is the one that should be debated, and you want to make your argument seem probable and at least have that backed up. So, talking about inherency on like the con side or like promoting economic growth, if you wanted to say like advocate for a policy to promote economic growth, I wouldn't say things such as, well, one argument that has a lot of inherency is simply put just like tax cuts, right? Because we see it's already happening. The current administration really wants tax cuts and really are all in for tax cuts. So that's where the inherency comes from. So like as you're crafting arguments and crafting your cases this topic, you have to make sure that your arguments have some inherent truth to it, because that makes your job a hell of a lot easier because there's already a probability of it happening. So once again, inherency is just how probable, the probability of your argument occurring. Basically, you just have to come up with like some empiric proof that if the government right now were to choose a policy of reducing federal debt, they would choose the policy that you're advocating for. Okay, does anyone have any questions? I'll pause for like a minute. Just type the questions in the chat. Okay, I guess no questions. Alright, cool. So, let's move on to pro-argumentation. So, as in like every single debate, you want to have some arguments. So let's think about the types of arguments that the pro can make. Well, before we actually get there, let's talk about the pro-advocacy, right? So the pro is saying that the federal government should prioritize reducing the debt over promoting economic growth. So that means that however you interpret prioritize, whether it be do first or put more resources towards, that's what you're advocating for. In this instance, I'm just going to say prioritize means you do first. So if I'm the pro, I would say we should pass policies that reduce the federal debt first before we actually pass policies to increase economic growth. So with that said, let's actually get into the arguments that you could possibly run. Alright. So, right off the bat, like, the pretty general way to go is just, like, listing off a bunch of harms about, like, having a high federal debt. Like, our debt right now is, like, it's incredibly high. It's the highest it's been, like, since 1945, where we were, like, emerging from World War II and, like, the Great Depression. It was just a really tough time. So, yeah. We, evidently, our debt is currently like, at least numerically an issue. So, a lot of the general topics about, like, a lot of debt being bad is that it could cause financial collapse, right? Because, like, currently how it works is that the U.S. government, the Treasury, sells loans and bonds to other countries, basically saying, yeah, let me borrow your money, we'll pay you back later. And, like, a lot of these countries, China actually has, like, a substantial amount of our bonds, well, relative to foreign countries, but, like, a lot of the bonds are held by, like, U.S. citizens and, like, other nationals like that. So, inherently what happens is if our debt gets too high, the people who hold our bonds and who we borrow money from might believe that we'll never pay them back because our debt is only getting worse and worse and worse. And this creates an issue because if our donors don't think we're going to pay, our lenders, for a better word, don't think we're going to pay them back, then they'll increase their interest rates on the loans, or will just stop, like, funding us altogether. And this could cause a huge market crash and, like, decrease the stability of the U.S. market, hurting businesses across the board, because the United States will seem less economically stable, and a less economically stable country drives away investors that are key to, like, businesses growing and the economy doing well. So I mentioned a thing about how the people who borrow our money will increase interest rates, and this is a second avenue of argumentation. So currently what happens is that the money, like, it's kind of like a bank, right? When you put money in a bank, you get interest on it, that type of thing. So how our debt works is that there's interest on our debt. So this means that each year we have to pay back the country who, like, owns some of our debt a certain amount of money. However, if our debt only increases as a whole, countries that lend money to us might increase the interest rate, which means they increase how much the U.S. has to pay back every year because they feel like the U.S. market is getting unstable. And this is bad because the more the interest rate climbs, the more of our, like, federal budget has to be, like, directed towards paying back those interest rates. And since we already don't have enough money, increasing interest rates means that we have to cut from other programs to pay them. And then this leads to the third avenue of argumentation, which is crowd out. Basically saying that if we have to dedicate more of our budget to paying off those interest rates, we won't have as much money to, like, pay for things such as Social Security, or, like, food stamps, or, like, other governmental benefits, or even things such as running the military, or other forms of discretionary spending, which is spending that is decided every year by Congress. So yeah, those are some three main lines of argumentation for the pro. So let's talk about that. So pro, there's one. There's interest rates. There's crowd out. And there's economic instability. Yikes, that's really ugly. Yeah, so those are some, like, huge arguments. Some other arguments can be about how. Oh, some other arguments can be about how if we reduce our debt now, it's easier to deal with it. It's easier to reduce debt now than in the future. And this banks off of the prioritization interpretation where you define prioritize as do it now. Because this argument makes logical sense. Currently, our debt is only increasing, and it's been increasing for like as the past couple of decades, right? So it's way easier to deal with, like, let's just say we have like $20 trillion of debt right now. Then it's easier to deal with $20 trillion of debt right now than like $80 trillion of debt in like 10 years down the road, right? Because like evidently 80 trillion is a heck of a lot more than like $20 trillion. So that's basically the crux of the argument, where it says, yes, we should prioritize reducing the federal debt because if we wait till later, it'll be like near impossible. So, yeah, so those are some main arguments. Another argument that's actually are echoed a lot in like papers is that there's a debt threshold. There's an argument. There's evidence by Reinhardt and Rogoff. One of them is a Harvard professor or something, and then there's also evidence by like Cicchetti or something like that that state that there is a threshold where if like debt is 90% of GDP, then the economy will just like go into a debt spiral. Like those threshold arguments are pretty good because they establish like a time frame of how things should be done. Like you could say, look, our debt is fast approaching 90% of our GDP. Thus, we need to prioritize reducing debt because if it gets to 90% of our GDP, our economy would just like blow up, right? So that's a very good like prioritization argument. The only like worry I have about running that type of argument is that like when I researched the topic, 10 minutes into research, I had 10 indicts, which is basically why like the methodology and the research is wrong. So I mean, like if you could find like a totally different study that concludes the same thing and it accounts for what the indicts talk about, then damn, that's a good study and I encourage you to run it. But yeah, there's just like a lot of problems with the research that try to establish thresholds where if debt gets to X amount, our economy would like die. So I mean, that's another idea you could look into. It's definitely worth it. Also, there's arguments where like, since foreign countries like, let's just say China, hold a lot of our debt, they could weaponize that debt and make our economy suffer. Basically say that they could rapidly sell off or dump the bonds we give them, meaning that we wouldn't have that money anymore and then our markets will like be very unstable. And the inherency behind why that will happen is because of like the U.S.-China trade war gives China a reason to like dump our bonds in the first place. So that's a possible argument. So those are just a couple of pro arguments. I won't really go into the details. There's like a heck of a lot more, but that's up to y'all to research. So yeah, now that we've talked about the pro, let's actually go on to the con side. Alright, I'm just going to say right off the bat, personally I think the con has it super easy. Like, let's just start with the resolution first, right? The con really has like an easy interpretation. The con doesn't necessarily have to say, oh, hold up. Give me a second. There seems to be a problem with my audio. Okay, I'm back. Is this still echoey? Oh god, huh. Um, yeah, okay, that's bad. Well, I only have a little bit more, so just deal with that. Sorry. When I try to cut this into a video, I'll try to see if I can edit that out a little bit. Okay, yeah, poor technology leads to an echo, but, alright, since there's an echo, let's make this quick. So, let's talk about the con arguments. For con, it's, yeah, like I said, I feel like the con burden is so much easier because you don't have to say that we should promote economic growth over, we should prioritize economic growth over reducing the federal debt. You just have to say we don't have to reduce federal debt over promoting economic growth. I don't know if that like makes a lot of sense. Like the resolution says we should prioritize reducing debt over promoting growth. So that's the pro's burden. Pro always has to argue that we need to reduce debt before or dedicate more resources to reducing debt than to promoting growth. However, the con team only just has to say, no, that doesn't have to happen. That means the con can say like quite a lot of things. The con can definitely say, yes, we should prioritize economic growth over reducing debt. So that's just like the inverse of what the pro is saying. Or the con can say, no, we don't have to prioritize the debt over economic growth because we can just do both of them the same. So that actually gives two avenues of broad argumentation for the con, and that's like really off balance in my opinion. Yeah, so there's different ways you can explore with that and just use it to your advantage. Alright, so let's actually get into the details of con argumentation. So on the con side, a huge central argument is that promoting economic growth will reduce debt. In essence, it makes a lot of logical sense, right? Because if your economy is growing, businesses are growing, consumers are spending more and making more, which means a lot of sales tax, means a lot of more income tax, and all other things. Like you don't even have to increase tax rate, because the increase in productivity turns out extra tax dollars. Because a more productive economy means more things to be taxed, and then that leads to more governmental revenue. And that's like the internal link or the way economic growth can actually reduce debt. Like if you look back towards like the Great Depression, right? FDR's whole like policy to getting us out of a recession was like governmental spending, right? Well, like recessions are not necessarily analogous to debt. Economic growth does stimulate quite a lot of the economy, and then this helps towards alleviating debt at least somewhat, right? So that's why you say, look, we should be actually prioritizing economic growth because in the long run, it reduces debt as well, right? Like, you have the best of both worlds. Or you could also say, look, we don't have to prioritize reducing debt. We can do economic growth and debt reduction at the same time because economic growth inherently reduces debt anyhow. So, yeah, hope that makes sense. If anyone has any questions, just like type it in chat. I feel for definitely gonna answer. Okay, so that's a huge argument on the con side that there's gonna be a lot of link debate about probably. Yeah. And then definitely you could argue a whole bunch of things about like why economic growth is good, right? You can talk about how economic growth increases wages, decreases crime, reduces poverty, increases jobs, increases social spending. so many like good impacts and benefits to economic growth. However, if you want to go that way, where you just list out a bunch of benefits of like promoting economic growth, you have to do something that's very critical, and you have to weigh, and you have to link it back to the resolution, right? Because just because you're saying that, like, just because you say, look, economic growth is good because it like lifts people out of poverty, like that isn't inherently a reason why we should like prioritize it over reducing the debt, right? Because one could argue reducing federal debt also lifts people out of poverty. So just listing the benefits of promoting economic growth aren't enough. You have to prove that the benefits are unique to promoting economic growth. That basically means that only by prioritizing economic growth can we achieve the benefit of poverty like reduction, right? Because like if you don't provide uniqueness, then it's not really a reason to vote for you. Because if both sides can give me $10, I don't really care who I choose. It's all the same, I get $10 anyhow. So yeah, providing uniqueness is very important, and it's super important on the con because like it's quite easy just to list out all the benefits of like promoting economic growth because everybody knows a good economy is just like good. There's like zero debate about it. So yeah, you probably want to be careful about that. So, yeah, there's two major avenues of argumentation for the con. Number one, basically saying, look, we are the we link into reducing debt. Because in benefit, like increasing economic growth increases government revenues. Like one possible narrative for the con could be this: look, by prioritizing economic growth, we do two things. We promote the economy, which leads to a litany of benefits, such as increasing jobs, increasing the amount of people who are lifted out of poverty, and that type of thing. In addition to these unique benefits that the pro doesn't even touch on, we also can reduce the federal debt, which is the pro's main advocacy. So this allows you to do two pretty damning things, right? It allows you to like talk about impacts that the pro can't even touch, like maybe say lifting people out of poverty. And then it also gives you a way to win pro's own argument by saying, look, we agree. All the pros' impacts about reducing debt are really good. We want to reduce debt. However, the pro isn't the only way to do this. We do it as well by promoting economic growth. In fact, we're even better than the pro because we reduce debt and we lift people out of poverty. So that's like a case structure on the con that everyone should look into. It's basically saying, yes, we do what you do, but we do more stuff as well. Like, if you like frame it that way, if you like talk about it that way, it's like pretty simple to vote for you, right? Because if like both teams can give me $10, but you could give me like $5 more, right? Then it's pretty easy to vote for the people who can give me like $15 in total. That's like simple logic, very intuitive for judges. So yeah, those are the two main like blocks of argumentation for the con. There's definitely like more diverse arguments out there, and I encourage everyone to go look them up because diverse arguments make debate fun. No one wants to hear the same thing 50 rounds in a row. That's terrible. Alright. Yeah, I think I'm done with this. I got through everything I wanted to do. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions? I'll just sit here for a while. since I don't think there's any questions, I'm going to be ending this. Alright, hope it was helpful for everyone. And, yep, have a good break.